I'll just do a quick introduction. Hello everyone, I'm Jackie. I'm the event host from RJ Julia. Thank you so much for coming. We're very excited to have Pat with us tonight, and it sounds like you may know exactly who he is, but I will give a quick introduction anyways. So Pat Pickens is a sports writer who has covered the NHL since 2013 for the New York Times, NHL.com, the Associated Press, Bleacher Report, and many others. Before that, he was the sports editor of the Fairfield Citizen and a sports writer for Hearst, Connecticut Media Group. He is a 2007 graduate of Sacred Heart University, and he resides in Jersey City with his wife Crystal, 2 kids, and Wheaton Terrier currently.
That's right.
So very safe to say that I think Pat knows a lot about sports. So very excited, as I'm sure you both are as well, to hear more about this book and the process to creating it. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks,
and
Jackie.
enjoy.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, we were sort of talking about this, and I think I've found this a fascinating topic because, I was in Connecticut. I don't know if you guys have heard me speak or how much you've heard me speak, if you've heard me speak, but, working in Connecticut, I started in 08. Actually, what Jackie just said, I went to college at Sacred Heart and, spent about 10 years off and on living in Connecticut. And I think, I really became, I'm a big hockey fan, grew up a hockey fan, grew up a Devils fan in New Jersey, and sort of, I always saw how 1995 affected me with the Devils, and they won the Stanley Cup that season, but there was always these rumors, flirtations with Nashville and prospects of potentially going south to a Sunbelt, city where, hockey isn't necessarily king, and so I, and then, to watch how hockey and sports evolved in the 90s as a child of the 90s, as a huge fan, and then to see, things like ballparks and things like cable deals and things like, evolution of markets and TV markets, and how TV became so much more important, and how hockey sort of came along with that. So, I'm a big hockey fan. I always say that the 04-05 Sacred Heart hockey team really scratched my itch, because the year of the NHL lockout, because it was really hard as a hockey fan to not have hockey. And then it came back in 05-06, and the Hurricanes won the Stanley Cup. And I remember feeling very attached to that year, because again, I was so bummed that the NHL canceled their season 04-05, and then the Devils had this sort of memorable year where they went, they rallied to win their division, and then they played the Hurricanes. The Hurricanes blew them out in the second round of the playoffs. And I just remember those Hurricanes were really strong, really powerful. And I remember, feeling very attached to that year, because it was such a great final series. And yet, if you look at the numbers, like hardly anybody watched it. It was on Outdoor Life Network, and it was NBC, had some of the games, but it's a punchline, OLN's involvement with that. But to me, it was fascinating to see that in less than 10 years, the Hurricanes had gone from moving to the Stanley Cup, and the Avalanche had done it in the 90s as well. They moved from Quebec, and so I was in Connecticut when they won the Cup, and it was sort of interesting how it didn't even register down where I was, but then to hear some of the stories of people in Connecticut who were very disappointed, were very upset, felt like this was their opportunity that got lost in the future. So I filed that away, and in 2008 I said I started at the Fairfield Citizen as a sports editor there for 5 years, and I became really I started covering high school hockey, and the fascinating thing for me was to see the high school kids who had been toddlers or 5, 6, 7 at the most in Whalers gear at state playoff games, and to see them in jerseys, or see them in toques, or see them in, the beanies, hats, and sweatshirts, and all those things. And it was one of those things that, or if I would go, on my off day, go out to, Trumbull Mall or Danbury Mall, or, any places around the state, there'd be huge, you guys all see them, the huge displays of Whalers stuff. And I was like, well, what's, this team's been gone for more than 10 years. What's its story there? So I filed that away. And, my career as a journalist was it was really not going well for a long time. And, 2011, I was just like, I need to do something, I didn't want to, I had gotten a job in Connecticut as during the recession. It was really hard because I was happy to have a full-time job and, get my foot in the door, pay some dues and stuff, but I didn't expect to be there that long. And I need to sort of, make something happen. So I had the idea for the book when I said, in '08, when realizing that the book hadn't been done before, History of the Whalers had not been done. The only previous history, Nathan knows, is Jack Laudier's book in 1987, which was funded by the team, and obviously a lot had happened since '87 to 2008. So I sort of dug into it, I started with a blank canvas. I don't, like I said, I grew up a Devils fan, and obviously aware of the Whalers, but certainly not a huge Whalers fan. Certainly not anyone who would be a encyclopedic, have an encyclopedic knowledge of it at the time. But I really just started, and I just, dug and tried to get a hold of people and sort of cold email people and tried to get as many people as possible. And I was fortunate because there's a lot of Whalers alumni in the NHL, and, Ron Francis and Kevin Dineen and Joel Quenneville was, he'll be back again soon, and Dave Tippett and, again, was and probably will be again at some point. All these guys. And actually, my sports editor for the Fairfield Citizen was the first contact, and he got me in touch with Ken Holland. Ken Holland played one game with the Whalers in 1979-80, and he was, he didn't know me, and I didn't know him, and to the point where he said, look, you're not interviewing me to ask me about the prospects of Hartford as an NHL market, because I'm not speaking for that. I'm just telling you stories. And I was like, okay, sure. And then it was Mark Howe, and then it was Stan Fischler and Howard Baldwin and all these people through the years that were so generous with their time and so helpful, and it just sort of picked up steam. Like I said, I think it was part to network with people for sure and try to advance my career. But then as I got into it, I realized there was a real story here. There was a real interesting and fascinating story, a tale of with a really interesting arc where the Whalers with this, they were like the most successful team in the WHA through those years in WHA, and then they went from the WHA to being terrible in the NHL, terrible trades, Mark Howe, and trading their first round pick and firing coaches and GMs and ill-advised moves, and then under Emile Francis they really took off and they became a legitimate cup contender, and some of those playoff losses just were just devastating. 86 in Montreal, and the next year with Quebec, and a couple years in the Bruins there, and then obviously the Ron Francis trade, which was such a detrimental. It was called Michael Arrace, who covered the team for the Current, now is in Columbus, said called it the detonation of an era, and just the fact that it was just essentially, he was the face of their franchise. He's Ronnie Franchise, and then they traded him, and season ticket sales dwindled, and they sold to Karmanos, and Karmanos. It was certainly, obviously, I know you guys, I'm sure you guys aren't wild about him. I know, Nathan, you're certainly not. But it was just such an interesting time. And again, it's such this evolution. I started, the working title for the book was going to be The Perfect Storm for a lot of reasons, because, it was this confluence of events that happened that really, combined to really sabotage hockey in Hartford. And then I think why I closed it with, I closed it with two chapters, one about the Hurricanes and then obviously about the future. But with the Hurricanes, I think I couldn't tell the story of the Whalers without doing the Hurricanes, that 2002 run and the 06 Cup final, the Cup, because it just ran so contrary to all those years in Hartford where, they were good, where the teams in Hartford were good, or they were competitive, or they were both. And they just, sabotaged by these terrible bounces or these terrible luck or this terrible, or the Canadians or the Bruins or whoever. And it was just this sort of, and then, they go south to Carolina, and in 5 years they're in the Cup final. They're playing the Red Wings, and they're, minutes away from being ahead. And then, as a result of the lockout, if they could have held on in Hartford, to the lockout, they probably would have, be potentially thriving like the Hurricanes are now. But it's unfortunate that some cities and some markets didn't last and didn't stand, and it's really it's too bad because we were just talking before that this is there is some potential here as a market in terms of. It obviously depends on a lot of factors, and and we can get into that if you guys have questions. But so that was a little bit about my process and why I sort of did things the way I did. I like I said, very grateful to the people who helped me through the years, and 10 years of from first interview to the book came out in October. It was actually 2 weeks short of 10 years, but it was close enough. And then the reception's been terrific, and I'm grateful for that. So. That's a little bit about that. I don't know if you guys have questions about my process. I just sort of want to, make this a conversation. I don't want to just sit here and talk the whole night, because I'm sure you guys have a lot of thoughts and questions, and I'll be happy to, like I said, just have a conversation and see what you guys have as far as thoughts.
I think I told you my feeling on Carmano, so it isn't nearly as bad as most people here think. I think he's horrible at public relations. He's got to clean that up. But as I've told you, it's one thing I didn't tell you is that I was also an intern for the Whalers in '96, and that was during the season ticket campaign. Yeah. So I did have a lot of inside information as to really what they were trying to build, and that they were actually genuine about trying to keep the team here.
Sure.
And that was when I was my senior year of high school.
Okay.
And since then, I mean, the thing that I love about this book, obviously I'm a huge Whalers fan, but I feel like it has tons of parallels to exactly what is happening geopolitically today in the world, because everyone wants to point the finger at someone else and see, it's all their fault. Yeah. It's all their fault. And nobody actually looks at the whole story and the whole facts behind it, and then looks within themselves and say, well, what did we do wrong?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And I've been hearing this basically misinformation, most perpetrated by Jeff Jacobs, who you interviewed for this book.
Sure.
Blaming Carmano, saying it was all his fault, not talking about anything else, all the corruption in Roland.
Yeah.
That I thought was the biggest contributor. But then the other
only good thing he ever did was Yukon 2000. Roland did.
Even that even wasn't completely him either. So, but how do you deal with it when I still hear it today? How do you deal? I mean, it's gotten less and less over the years, because I think some people have realized. But how do you deal with it today when someone comes up to you and says, "The Whalers left. It was all Carmanos' fault. I hate the Hurricanes." I can't stand hearing that.
I think Carmanos. I think I wrote this in the book. Is that Carmanos is an easy scapegoat because he doesn't care. Frankly, he's not proud, but he's content to be the villain, and because he wrote in and he wrote out. He's a stubborn guy for sure, but I don't think I like I said, I wanted to call it the perfect storm because there was this huge confluence of events that everybody got swept up in. I'm sure, Nathan, then the story about them being kicked, or the perception of them being kicked out by the governor. You mentioned Roland, and I don't know. To hear Pete Carmano tell that story to me is interesting because I wouldn't have taken it. I'll tell the full story just so you're up to speed. And so it was January of '97. Nathan mentioned they did a season ticket drive to try and keep the team. Carmanos had save the Whalers. Carmanos promised them 4 seasons. That was the 3rd season. They were trying to make some inroads. They had the Brendan Shanahan thing where they had traded him earlier in the year after questionably trading for him in the first place. But it's. Like I said, that's why I think I'm grateful that I had a blank canvas for this whole thing, because, and so many other people have told me, that they wanted to do stories like this, but they couldn't either pass it, or they were, people, their publishers passed, or, they pitched it and it wasn't the right time or whatnot. I think that's why I said I'm so excited to have this blank canvas, because, and that Pete Carmanos gave me the time, a couple hours. I went to Michigan to talk to him and get his perspective on these things. And like I said, so the story is that they had a meeting, Gary Bettman, Peter Carmanos, and John Rowland in the governor's mansion in January of '97. And they come together. They said, if the press asks you, Bettman and Carmanos tell Rowland, if the press presses you and asks you whether the team needs to leave if they don't get a new arena, don't say yes. And so first question gets up there. Rowland answers the question: if the Whalers don't get a new arena, do they need to leave? And Roland says yes. So Karmanos' perception of that was that that's Roland kicking them out. And that was the end there. And I know that, you know, I've heard other players believe that. Kevin Dineen said the same thing, that he saw Roland in future appearances say things like, you know, laugh about the Whalers leaving and sort of, you know, joke about it. And there's obviously this perception of that the Patriots were the big driver in driving the Whalers out. I don't know that to be true because the people I didn't get to talk to the governor, but I did get to speak to some of his people, and they made it seem that there was room to do both. And I don't know that to be true necessarily. That could be just revisionist history. But yeah, no, I think, you know, like I said, Karmanos is a easy scapegoat because he got in front of the press and he said, look, we're leaving. And they were leaving a year early. So he promised them 4 years. He left after 3. He paid $20 million in an exit fee to get out of Hartford. And so was with nowhere to go, too. You know, he was going to go to Columbus.
What of the argument that he wanted to move another team to Detroit?
Well, I don't... he's definitely a Midwest guy. He's definitely a Big Ten guy. You know, in terms of cities. And, the places he looked in Columbus, which is where he thought he was going. And then the referendum on the arena deal fell through. And he tried to go to Minneapolis, and it didn't happen there. Chuck Hayton, actually, and I did an event a couple months ago where I found out that he was looking into Vegas. And the league wouldn't let him go to Vegas at that time in 1997. He had told me, Karmanos had said he was trying to look at San Diego, but there were some things wrong with it. Obviously, Anaheim was there and LA also there. So, but two of the cities he was trying to go to was, I mean, he wanted to compete with the Illiches for sure. Because there is this perception, my understanding, Pete Karmanos wouldn't admit this to me, but my belief is that he, billionaires want to compete with, they don't have many people to compete with. So like the Illiches they weren't letting go of Detroit. The Red Wings, the city's not big enough for 2 NHL teams for sure. Especially, you mentioned Boston and New York, imagine 2 teams in Detroit. One is deeply rooted as the Red Wings are. So I would say that was probably unlikely, which is why, maybe Columbus, maybe Minneapolis. He didn't like Minneapolis, didn't like some of the economics there at the time, and then also the NHL was expanding there after they had moved from Minneapolis to Dallas. So I think the way he left a lot of bad taste in people's mouths. I would say just because he announced in March that they were leaving, didn't have a place for them to go, and then like I said, once Columbus fell through, they were left scrambling there to the point where it was sort of this indignity of the city. The team is gone, but it doesn't have it's not going anywhere, quite yet officially. So, and again, Karmanos like you said, if Karmanos had a PR campaign that said, "Look, I needed to leave because this is what happened," then maybe the people would say, "Okay, this was an untenable situation." And I mean, I think Richard Gordon gets a pass from a lot of people in this area because even though the Current was, you mentioned Jeff and the Current, and they got on him pretty hard when the team left. They called him 1A in terms of the reason they left. But Richard Gordon, who bought the team from not Howard Baldwin, he bought him from the conglomeration of corporations in Hartford and ran them and managed them for 88 to 94, 6 years, essentially leveraged off all rights and business dealings. And again, this was as the business of sports became so important with TV deals and parking and concessions and having all the rights to those things, and Richard Gordon leverages all that out to the state because he's in debt. He's losing millions of dollars a month, and in the TV deal, interesting. Pete Karmanos told me that Howard Baldwin actually negotiated the TV deal in 1982, negotiated a 20-year deal, and kept all the money. And didn't put it back in the team, just put it in his pocket. And by the time that deal would have expired, they were going to play for the Cup as the Carolina Hurricanes. So it's really, I think Karmanos, like I said, will take it because he just he doesn't care about how he's perceived up here as far as he's concerned. He came here and he tried it here and to hear him talk about it is to make it seem like he is, from his point of view, he thinks he tried to make it work as best as he could here, as opposed to, you know, Jim Rutherford and Tom Thews. Thews was his financial backer, and Rutherford, you know, obviously the longtime general manager of the Hurricanes, actually had a partial ownership stake as well in the team. He told me, Pete Carmano said that Rutherford and those guys were trying to get him to get out of there because there was no potential there, and that Carmanos made it work as long as he could. But you know, I like I said, I just think he's content to be the villain because it's something he can own and something he can wear, and he does. And like, I agree that the PR campaign could be better where if he said, look, if my hands were tied, I needed to move, maybe he'd get a bit of a pass, but it's not something that he has cared to do. I don't know if maybe talking to me, and I don't want to overstate my own influence on this, but you know, maybe talking to me for some of this stuff was part of that, you know, that he knew he could get across and get the word out there that this is what happened from his vantage point, because he doesn't talk about Hartford that much, and that's why I was so excited to talk to him, you know, about it, and that he, you know, to get his real thoughts on what happened and how it went down. And because I heard, like I said, talked to Kevin Dineen and a few other players, and to hear them talk about the perception of them being kicked out, I didn't get it, because I didn't, you know, I'd done my research, but to hear them say get kicked out, it just didn't make sense to me. And then to hear Carmanos explain it, it still doesn't make sense to me. But I guess, you know, in terms of that's not how I would perceive it, but you can see where they would perceive it as such, that they had this meeting, they had this discussion. You know, don't say that they need to move, and then he does it as the first question to the, you know. So.
But then, what of the years in between 06 to like 2018, where Carolina just lowest attendance of the league?
Yeah.
Everyone was saying they're
Yeah.
going to
Well,
move
like
that.
Sure.
09?
Yeah, 09 they made a run to they won the Cup in 06, they missed the playoffs 07, 08, 09 they went to the conference final and got swept by the Penguins, and then they missed the playoffs for 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that's in the book too, is this sort of, I'm going to ask you guys how you feel about some of this stuff, because I was in Raleigh for Whalers night in January, and they invited me down to be a part of it, you know, sign some books and be on TV and some of that stuff. And they explained it to me that, to your point, you know, they were terrible. They were, and Carmanos, you know, Tom Thews died in there, and they had some really bad teams. They had some really bad coaching. They had some unfortunate circumstances in some cases, you know, in terms of bounces, you know, to miss the playoffs. But to miss the playoffs that many years in a row takes some doing from an organizational perspective. And they had, you know, Jim Rutherford moved out, went to Pittsburgh, and Ron Francis became the GM. And then, you know, I said Carmanos lost his financial backer, so he sold. He's actually still a minority owner of the Hurricanes, but he sold the majority of the share to Tom Dundon. Yeah. And Dundon came in and said, "How do we get some momentum behind this?" And you know, he got a couple guys. Interestingly enough, he got a couple guys in his marketing department from the Tri-State area. You know, one's from Westchester, one's from northern New Jersey. And they said, you know, Carmanos wouldn't touch the Whalers logo because there was so much bad blood between Hartford and between Carmanos. He didn't. To hear him, he might be a little bitter, but he told me he doesn't. His exact quote, I believe, in the book is, "I don't know what's so special about the Hartford Whalers, or there's nothing special about the Hartford Whalers," which is
except that it makes money.
Yeah, well, yes.
That was just a blatant cash grab.
Yeah, but yes, but the point is that so Dundon says, what can we do? Well, we need some momentum. We need something we can control, because they had made the playoffs in almost going on 10 years.
Yeah.
And the attendance was terrible. They were, you know, they were worse than bad. They were irrelevant.
And there was rumors that he wanted to move him to Houston anyway.
Well, sure. So
well, that Dundon might have won.
Yeah,
Dundon, exactly.
Well,
yeah.
Sure, but so they wanted to get some. They said they had, you know, the goal was Whalers Night was designed at being a marquee event that they could control, that they could put themselves on the league marquee, and essentially, you know, had the league take notice of the Carolina Hurricanes, and it just so happened that was the sort of this jumping off point to this season where they went to the conference final, and they had the storm surge, they had the bunch of jerks thing with Don Cherry, but it all started with this Whalers night, which has since become their 80s night sort of thing, but they haven't lost wearing the Whalers jersey, so there's something there to it. And then
Lost in regulation.
well, right.
Yeah.
So
I was at the game in Boston,
correct,
yeah.
right. Yeah,
And
they haven't lost on home ice wearing the Whalers jersey, but yes, they did lose to the Bruins in Boston. And John Forsland said it felt very much like a Whalers game in Boston. Good enough to be there. So many fans there, and obviously not without controversy. The Jack Edwards, Dougie Hamilton, number 19, Pi McKenzie issue, which
That actually was just a way for Jack Edwards to trash Dougie Hamilton.
Yeah, wow.
It was nothing more than that.
and the Whalers brand for sure.
Yeah.
But
Which is odd because he's kind of been pro Whalers in the past.
yeah. So the point was that they wanted something to control. It was a cash grab for sure,
Yeah.
but there were elements of it that nodded to Hartford. They did give some money to Bob Crawford's rink up there, and they had all the former Whalers come on. They had Mike Rogers, the longtime Whalers center, was in the booth. The puck drop. Mike Rogers told me that there were so many. The interesting thing to me about the 0-2 Cup run for the Hurricanes was there were so many Hartford elements in that run, which is why I had to include it as deeply as I did in the book. But the fact that so many people in Hartford were so touched and pleased by it was interesting to me. Members of the Booster Club, again, former Whalers. And it's fascinating to me because I saw this, again, firsthand where, the Triangle region in North Carolina is very much a region of transplants, where it's, Pittsburgh and Buffalo, Western New York and New England and New Jersey and New York, and people, moving south for better weather and better, more affordable costs of living and, friendlier tax dollars or what have you. But there are people who live there who were Whalers fans who say, this is, I did the same thing this team did. I'm coming south to retire, to work or to do all these things. I don't got sick of the cold Connecticut winters and those things too. And they support the Hurricanes. And there's fans up here. They support the Hurricanes. That's still. And I'm curious, because there's, like I said, and there were just people also in the Booster Club that said, we want to see the logo. That's all we want to see the jersey. We want to see the logo. We want to see the Hartford Whalers on the ice, whether it's paraphernalia, whether it's jerseys, hats, sweatshirts, the same thing that the kids that were in the rink, going to the state playoff games. Now, you talk, again, I brought this up to Chuck Hayton, and Chuck Hayton hated that idea. He hated that whole concept, but Chuck might be a little bitter because the Hurricanes let him go.
Yeah, I think he would have had a different take on that if Dundon had kept.
Agree, and Forsland I talked to before they let him go, so I haven't talked to him since about that. He said that that the way it came out the first time, they did it such as like the celebration of Whalers history, and John was so integral in that because he was this link to the past in terms of that. He was such a he's so respected and revered by Hurricanes fans, but also among people in New England. He's a New Englander. He's originally from the Boston area, so but I would like to talk. I'm planning to talk to him again in the future about how he feels about this. But to hear that perspective and then to see some people again who are from Connecticut who moved south or who are from North Carolina who sort of latched on, because the people in North Carolina don't love it necessarily either because they didn't ask for the Whalers. They didn't ask for a history lesson necessarily. They didn't. As far as they're concerned, their team's history started in 1997, and then they moved to Raleigh, and then it became their team. So, but it's interesting because like I said, you talk to 20 different people, and you get 15 or 20 different perspectives, and I wonder what you guys think about the Whalers Nights in general.
Well, I love it. As
Yeah.
I told you before,
Yeah.
I've remained a fan of the team, that I was able to, I was appalled. It was after my freshman year in college when this went down, and I was absolutely appalled by the way the media was portraying this, when to me it was so obvious what the real culprit was.
Sure.
That the main one was Roland,
Yeah.
and of course there's all the things in the past,
Yeah.
like with the Francis trade being the turning point.
Yeah.
And it's like, why take out a political event on a team and these players?
Yeah.
And so and yeah, it's like I said, some Whalers fans, former Whalers fans, I've just been constantly arguing with over this. And
Yeah.
something that I'm sick of, which is why I'm glad the book is here.
Yeah.
They'd say, read this book.
Yeah.
So, and as you saw, also probably seen in pictures on my Facebook page that I played in the alumni
Yeah.
games there,
Yes.
the annual alumni game,
Yeah.
all of them.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned about, so I actually loved the fact, and I go down there every time
Yeah.
they wear the Whalers jerseys, I go
Yeah.
down there for that game.
Yeah. You're not alone either, too. There
yeah.
were other people who reached out who were like, "Hey, you know, I'm here. You want to get together?" And I was, just didn't have the time to. But
Yeah. You also mentioned though about the years of how bad they were
Yeah.
and how, I was still a fan because, Francis was there too, my
Yeah.
childhood role model.
Deneen.
Yeah. Well, Deneen
Right.
wasn't there, but
Right.
but Francis was there. Wesley
GM.
was there
Yeah.
at the time too.
Yeah.
So I agree that it was bad coaching. Paul Maurice, Kurt Muller, and especially Bill Peters
Yeah.
was really bad.
Yeah.
Also, their goaltending wasn't as good as it should have
Well,
been.
Yeah.
too,
Some could
during those
some could
years.
blame Bill Peters for that too.
Yeah. And and Francis, I think he originally built the team that they now have, with
Yeah.
the
Oh,
I agree
real
with that.
exception
Sure.
of the
Tahoe.
goaltending.
Pick's
Tahoe,
great, yeah.
Slavin, and
Yeah.
and Pesci, and
And-
all those guys.
Right, and I guess the problem is that, and I think from what I've heard in Seattle, because actually one of the women who play in the goalie, Wendy Thomas, who plays in the
Okay,
alumni game,
okay.
she lives in Seattle
Okay.
now. Or, well, she did live in Seattle, they
Yeah.
moved to Raleigh briefly, now back in Seattle. She had told me that also the coach in Seattle is terrible.
Dave Hextall.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So apparently Francis, he's good at building the players, but not good at
Targeting a
treating
coach.
coaches.
Which
Yeah.
I'm surprised you said Maurice is bad because I'm a Winnipeg Jets fan on the side when
Yeah.
I'm out rooting for the Bruins.
Winnipeg Jets, though, with the year they lost to Vegas
Oh,
in
that hurt.
the year they lost to Vegas in the conference
Yeah.
finals.
Yeah.
I am convinced that on paper the Winnipeg Jets that year had the best team in the NHL
Oh, yeah.
and should have won the cup.
Sure.
And I
Yeah.
think it was Maurice's coaching that sank them.
It's
Yeah.
it's
Because
interesting.
Maurice doesn't know what offense is.
It's interesting though because I'm not gonna say a bad word about Paul Maurice just because I love talking. I love hearing the.
Well, I think he's a good person.
He's
I just
terrific.
I just don't think he's a good coach.
Sure, I
Yeah.
think there's definitely something to that, and you look at. The run to the Cup final in 2002 was definitely hallmarked by great goaltending, Archer Survey and Kevin Weeks in the first round too. But and there's got to be something there because he hasn't been to the he's been to the final, but he hasn't won the Cup. And it was surprising to hear him talk about 2002 because I was like I thought he would have won it at some point. Then I obviously went back and he hasn't. But you're never going to get me to say a bad word about Paul Maurice just because.
Yeah, I agree with
So
that.
many people say such great things. Nathan, I'm sure you're aware of his impact in Carolina when they moved down there, and that he made time for everybody, and that he was so open and honest, but also very genuine. There were those of us who have spent some time around players, around coaches, around teams. If you ask a stupid question, sometimes as a media member, you'll get a terrible answer for it. John Tortorella is obviously well known for trash and press, and the people who got to cover those early year Hurricanes teams, they didn't know what was going on. They didn't know what they were watching. Like the fans didn't, the players obviously did, but the fans didn't, and the media certainly didn't. So him being this sort of very amicable and friendly and not respectful and all these words. And it's interesting because he and Ronnie Francis are from the same town of Sault Ste. Marie, and Maurice is actually younger than him.
Yep.
Which is sort of wild to think about that Paul Maurice was coaching Ron Francis and Ronnie was like 5 years older than him, and but in that he came in at Hartford and was 28 years old behind the bench of the Hartford Whalers, as their head coach full time, and there's definitely something missing there with him, and I'd love to see him coach again just because I love hearing him talk about hockey and hearing him make sense of hockey, whether it's good or bad or indifferent. And the Jets in 18 were awesome with Connor and Scheifele, and their defense was really good, and then the defense fell off a cliff. But they won that series in Nashville and then didn't have any juice left for Vegas. But yeah, I think it's wild to think about him as a 28-year-old and then in 30 years he was, he's this elder statesman who's not even 60 years old in in some ways. So, but that's another incredible factor of the Whalers history of the Whalers. It's to hear Paul Maurice talk about Peter Carmano as this purveyor of opportunity. I think it was the way he put it. That not a lot of people would understand necessarily. And then to hear him describe Raleigh and Hartford as essentially parallels. They're not dissimilar markets in terms of the basketball craziness, in terms of the size, in terms of some of that stuff, and sort of underappreciated cities in the history of the sport. And you can, I think, I don't, obviously Raleigh is no big market, but there's people there, and there's people who've grown to love the team, and obviously making the playoffs and being cup contender really helps that. And I think that's what really hurt the Whalers too, in those years after the Francis trade, is that they built the wrong way. They tried to build, they were trying to build a team, and they were trying to build and then there was so much flux in terms of front office. There's Brian Burke, and then Brian Burke's out, and then Paul Holmgren's the GM, and he was let go, had his various issues, which thank goodness he's gotten figured out. But and then Rutherford and Carmano's come in, and there's some stability there, and then it just didn't last. They said they were going to build a winner. They knew hockey was the term, I think, that actually Jeff told me that they had used. But sure enough, they did. They knew how to build a hockey team. They knew how to build a hockey program. And in 8 years, they were in the Cup final. And in 12 years after they bought and moved, they were the champions. And now some of that was, again, fortuitous, because in 06 they had guys fall in their laps because the teams needed to get under the salary cap, and I think again, Carmano said it, and he's right. They caught every break in the book in that run to the Cup. They had, in the second round the Devils won a face off that Brodeur would typically field and flip out, and he couldn't play it because of the trapezoid, and the Hurricanes came and tied the game and won in overtime. It would have been 1-1, and said it was 2-0 Carolina. And then in the conference final, Game 7, Brian Campbell puck over the glass, and they score on the power play. They had the thing in the trapezoid again to some degree with Rolison got injured, and then they scored that goal late. And I think, but I think it was, like I said, part of that chapter, the Hurricanes and the 06 Cup run, was sort of me scratching the personal itch of this. I love this 06 Cup run because that series was so interesting and fascinating, and I had Chris Pronger to speak to him, and he never called me for some reason. I'm a little bitter about that, but I had plans. I made the plans to speak with him, and he just never called me for whatever reason. I followed up several times, and it is what it is. But that 06 to follow the history of the Whalers and to follow their the reason people believe, and my belief is there's something to this too, that the Ron Francis trade was propagated in part because he didn't want, Richard Gordon couldn't pay him, but also because, to hear John Forsland talk about they had missed the playoffs, they had been out in the first round 4 years in a row, 87, 88, 89, 90. And they didn't know what they had in Ron Francis in terms of, is he a great player? Is he a very good player? He's obviously a number one center, but is he our number one center, or is he, one of the best centers in the game? And, Ed Johnson goes from Pittsburgh to Hartford and then goes right back to Pittsburgh and coaches Mario and Francis and Lemieux and all these guys. And they're,
I actually, when that happened, when Johnson was hired as the head coach for the beginning of the 93 season, I actually thought the NHL should have avoided that trade. Because to me, that should have shown an obvious conflict of interest.
Yeah, but, by that point, it had been almost 2 years, since the trade. And, unfortunately, John Cullen never, panned out. And the he ended up getting offloaded for just, I think it was a third-round pick or a second-round pick. So, essentially, and it was Samuelson, too. Ulf Samuelson, one of the, not a necessarily premier defenseman, but a great defenseman who was really instrumental in them putting the Penguins over the top in terms of some of the runs with Cam Neely and the physical presence he provided, and then Francis obviously was this, became a let Mario Lemieux play offense while he could play the shutdown role in the playoffs. Just was the missing link. And then in 5 years the Whalers go from 11,000 season ticket holders to 6, and it was but to that point you just made, that I just heard Emily Kaplan on ESPN talk about the Hurricanes had 5,000 season ticket holders when Tom Dundon took over, and then so they really needed to make some inroads in that market. And I think obviously co-opting is the word that I used. I know people aren't ecstatic about that because they think, like you said, in people's minds it's a cash grab, and it's they stole the brand and took people's history. And I think that's what makes the Whalers, part of the Whalers, so fascinating in terms of a organization, because it's a living and breathing organization, not just as the Carolina Hurricanes, but as its own, standalone brand. And, Howard Baldwin said 10 years ago that it was the 11th most popular logo and brand in terms of sales in the NHL then, and they hadn't existed in 15 years. And it's only gotten more popular since then, since the Hurricanes have started wearing it on the ice. And even before that, so they said that they needed to control something. They ran the Whalers Night, and it really took off, and they haven't stopped doing it since. They did 2020, they did it, and they 2020, the 2021 season, they had a reverse retro jersey, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, the gray with in terms of the only shared color between the teams. And then this year they did the Whalers Nights again with the full crowd down at Raleigh against the Devils in January, and it was just so. I think it's a unique. I think it's what makes these teams, what makes this organization unique still, because the Avalanche wore the Nordiques jersey, and I don't know if there's people in Quebec who are too ecstatic about that, but there's definitely still people in Hartford who are like, okay, this is not only fine, this is great, and so I think it's just unique to have this sort of shared existence where, for one night a year, they're the Hartford Whalers again, and they could play the Brass Bonanza, and they can, come to the ice with Brass Bonanza. It's like going into a time capsule, or going to Time Machine and coming out and seeing the fans clap along to it and cheer along to the team wearing the Hartford Whalers jersey. And to the point you just made, Nathan, earlier, is that they haven't lost at home in these, and they only lost the 1 point in the game in Boston the first year, which that was great, watching the Whalers play in the green. I just remember watching that first game and just listening to John Forsland talk about it, and listening to Mike Rogers talk about it, and just feeling like this was something that was special in the history of the Hurricanes, but also the Whalers. And then again, they sort of used that as the jumping off point to this run to the conference final that unfortunately ended at the hands of the Bruins that season. Sort of left it as a constant, is a continue, something that they're going to continue to do for years to come. And then there's still talk that maybe they'll play a preseason game up here in the future, or maybe they'll play a regular.
Interesting. I haven't heard a lot of conversations about that.
Love that.
But it's interesting too, because we were talking about the market and the potential of the market, and I think Howard Baldwin and I talked about 10 years ago. Yeah. And he came back as essentially as the CMO of the Connecticut, Hartford Wolf Pack.
And that's like the only time that minor league team has had success. And you were saying earlier about the Bruins. I don't think the Bruins necessarily on the market. I think being able to market a division that has Montreal, the Rangers, the Bruins, and the Whalers, hockey fans would go bananas for that. The Whaler fans, I understand why they didn't pick up with the Wolfpack, because Rangers, arch rival, farm team. You're not going to support the farm team.
And they were marketed as the Rangers too.
Yeah, and they refused to pour any marketing money into it. Whereas now UConn is the Hartford team.
Right.
Yeah.
Like the Whaler fans have really glommed onto it, and I see it in the difference in crowd.
Yeah, for sure. And you talk to people who are to that exact point, that they don't want to support. The Ranger fans would come to Hartford Whaler games and chant, "You play in a shopping mall," and then they're supposed to, and pick fights and cops and EMTs and ambulances and whatnot, and they need twice the number of cops to arrest people at the Ranger games, as opposed to, and then you're supposed to support that organization right away. So I think there's definitely been something to that where it's been slow to sort of latch onto that, and then to see Howard come back and really make an effort to try and attract an NHL team. That was his goal. I mean, he came back because he's got the history, he's got the ear of, had the ear of Gary Bettman. He had owned the team, the Penguins. He had owned, he founded the San Jose Sharks, and then traded them for part of the North Stars. He's a hockey guy, and he was trying to bring it back. But it's interesting to me is that he laid out this plan that you guys I'm sure remember, for about $100 million in public money to renovate the Civic Center, with the XL Center. I always call it the Civic Center because that's, I'm sure you guys can understand that. But and the legislature laughed at him, and they said, "There's no way in hell we're going to give you $100 million." To attract a team. And then you look at where they're at now in terms of public money earmarked, and it's about $100 million, and they laughed Howard out of town, and ran him, sorry, go ahead, Nathan.
Well, that's why when you were talking earlier, before this started, about bringing a team back, is one of the reasons why I say absolutely not.
Yeah.
Not only, it is true, we can't control that we are too close to Boston and New York, but what we can control is how we market the Wolfpack, how we build ourselves up as a hockey market, and also we can control the infrastructure around that in making the Civic Center NHL ready. But when Baldwin came in here, now you have the guy who's bringing back the Whalers brand, who has his heart in it, therefore doesn't have his financial and business mind in it. Obviously should have never, never should have taken that deal.
Sure.
But he so badly wanted to make it work, took an absolutely horrible contract with AEG to play, to rank games with, play at the Wolfpack, play at the Civic Center. Horrible deal with the Rangers. So he had his heart in it, and then the state, AEG, and the New York Rangers take him for everything he's worth, and then we throw him out. So why do we how are we going to get a team back, an NHL team back here, if that's the way we treat someone who wants to bring an NHL team back here?
I think times change that for sure. You do have to consider in the fact that, again, not a lot of people were supporting the Wolfpack those 2 years when they were the Whale, yes. But
3
then
years,
when
actually.
3 years?
Because one year AEG ran them as the Connecticut Whale.
Okay. And rebranded them after the season.
It was when Spectre took them over, they went back to the
That explains it. So Spectre and AEG haven't really invested in the Wolfpack.
Right.
My argument is you build through the college hockey teams. Quinnipiac's run has generated a lot of attention, just like how Sacred Heart was your antidote during the lockout. Quinnipiac was that lockout for me, that antidote in 2012 and 2013. And I've seen how Whaler fans have really leaned in and gravitated towards the UConn games, and as that program's gotten better and better and better, you have UConn, you have Yale.
Best year ever.
Yeah, you have UConn, you have Yale, you have Sacred Heart, you have Quinnipiac. You have the CTS program that they're starting to really take off the ground here. It's you build through the college hockey programs, because you already were operating at a deficit with the Wolfpack. People weren't going to care. They only cared because Brass Bonanza was back. It was a Whale. They actually invested in listened to the fan base. I doubt Spectre and the Rangers are going to do that. They're just like churn the contract.
Well, and not only that, the state is essentially paying Spectre and the Rangers to be here, so they have no incentive to do anything if they're essentially getting paid to be here. So they make money. They make money no matter what.
They're just not going to leave.
They make money no matter what they do.
If it were a different farm system, like with the Blue Jackets, maybe it would be a different story. Maybe people would actually glom onto them because there's no real history of rivalry there, or like a more modern team. But the way you're going to build it is through the college hockey programs. I feel like that's the argument right now.
I think your point is taken, and I think it's not wrong in terms of the Rangers' impact on some of that stuff. I think there has been, and I don't know how deeply this goes, because some of the the real adamant Whalers supporters will never attach themselves to the Wolfpack, and some of the Wolfpack people don't want that support too from the people who are pro Whalers. But you look at the baseball team, and the baseball team does extremely well, being farm system for the Colorado Rockies.
Yeah.
And the ballpark is great. It's new. It's beautiful, but people will go see them 20, 30 nights a year, and they'll sell 8,000 tickets every night because they're Hartford. They're the Hartford Yard Goods, and they're the affiliate of some team. Who cares what affiliate they are?
Well, I think that's the key point. If it was the affiliate of the Red Sox or the affiliate of the Yankees or the Mets, that may sway people.
Maybe, but also I think the other thing too is, and I know this is the case because I've talked to people about this, is that Hartford people in Connecticut don't want to support a developmental league.
Yeah.
They don't want to. They don't care about the kids, the prospects coming through. The Islanders prospects coming through Bridgeport, or the Rangers prospects coming through Hartford. They want to support a major league team, and you're right that the college hockey programs are the way to do it. But also, the grassroots. Fairfield County. There's been a lot of, and not just to make it all about Fairfield County, but there's a collection of NHL players that came through Fairfield County, and they did it as Ranger fans, or Jonathan Quick did it as a Ranger fan. He's in New Haven County, but there's a lot of people, there's a lot of players, current, former, etc., who won the cup, brought it home. Ron Hainsey brought the cup back up near Hartford. Nick Bonino brought the cup to Avon Old Farms, where the Whalers practiced during their years, or a few years. So I think, and I think there were some misses in there in terms of the history of the Whalers too, because Craig Janney grew up a Whalers fan, and they had the opportunity to draft him, and they drafted Scott Young instead. And Janney killed the Whalers, and he essentially, because the Bruins ended up with him.
Well, actually, that was Emil Francis, although they probably should have drafted Janney just because of him being a Whalers fan.
Yes.
Scott Young actually did turn out in the long run to be a better player.
Better player, I'm not sure about, but I think the problem is that Janney killed him in the playoffs.
Well, that's true. He did kill him in the playoffs.
The 2 years.
And I guess Scott Young, though, I don't know why, for some reason,
he went to Colorado.
He didn't. For some reason, I guess he wasn't too thrilled about playing in Hartford either. I don't know why.
Craig Janney would have been, and not to compare the things, because obviously, like you said, if Emil Francis thought Scott Young was a better player, then you can't necessarily denigrate him for choosing.
I think definitely early in the career, like you were talking, like in the 80s and early 90s, Janney was the better player.
Yeah.
But Scott Young was more consistent in his
throughout the
longevity.
history, through the career. And he Stanley Cup winner with Colorado. But Craig, I think it was a miss in that regard, because I think I referenced this in terms of Bob Carpenter with Ron Francis the same time.
Where Francis turned out to be the better.
Right, where they wanted, both, the Capitals and Whalers both wanted Bob Carpenter, and Bill Dineen preferred Ron Francis, and so the Capitals traded up to draft Bob Carpenter, and Francis was far superior as a player, and but they wanted Carpenter in part because they were negotiating the TV contract, and he was from outside of Boston, Beverly, Massachusetts, and the can't miss kid on Sports Illustrated, but so in that instance it worked out in the Whalers' favor, but and again, if Emil Francis perceived Scott Young as a better player than Craig Janney, then that's his decision, and that's the one you live with. It's unfortunate because Janney became a Whalers killer, and he was a Whalers fan. He's from Enfield. In those days too, where they lost so much of that identity after the Francis trade. If they had a player like Craig Janney, where they say, hey, look, this kid he's been with us. He's from Enfield. He grew up a Whalers fan. I mean, that's so easy to. You guys know it's so easy to market. It's so easy to say, hey, look, we have a guy from Enfield. You're all from Enfield. Come buy season tickets. Come watch him. Or his friends and family would come and watch him. And then he went to Boston and helped them make the Cup final in '90. So it was just such a miss that doesn't get talked about a lot too. But
even despite that, I think, and I sent this to you, that had the Mike Liu trade not happened, I'm absolutely convinced the Whalers would have won the Stanley Cup in 1990. I think on paper, that was their best team they had while in Hartford.
Liu
was having a career year.
You're right.
You don't trade
the injuries with him were getting to be an issue, and you're right. The goaltending in that Boston series was an abomination.
Right.
but was it Sidorkovich?
Yeah, he had one good year, his rookie year. That was it.
Yeah, and so there was, and yet it's weird because goaltending's so fickle because he was that was the year he was good, 90 for the season.
Sidorkovich or Liu?
Sidorkovich, because
he
that's
was
why they made
so-so.
Liu expendable. And then he played that series against Boston, and he let in all those goals. I always point to that series, that Game 4, as such a turning point that people don't talk about. That it just and when I saw it, like I said, starting with a blank canvas, learning about the Francis trade. Okay, that's a terrible trade. Learning about the puck, the bounce, the Claude Lemieux play. Okay, that happens in Game 7. Sometimes you lose in overtime, but in the series with the Nordiques, okay, sometimes you're the better team and you lose a playoff series. This stuff happens. But they had those 2 terrible years against Montreal where the fans stopped coming too, which, there were...
In the playoffs.
Yeah, which was really bad look and detrimental and all sorts of, it was bad. But then they had the chance against the Bruins in 90. And I always point to that whenever I talk about this book, I talk about the 90 playoffs because it was such a turning point and it was right there. Because the 90 the Bruins went to the Cup final. They lost to the Oilers. Which, okay. But the Bruins they had a first-round series against the Whalers. It was the first playoff series against the Bruins, between the Whalers and Bruins. And the fans showed up. And they were 1-1 after Game 1, after 2 games going to Hartford. Raymond Bourque was injured, was not playing in that series, or he missed. Who was it? It was Grant Jennings messed him up.
Yes.
I believe in Game 2, in the late stages of Game 2. In this game that the Bruins had, the series made it 1-1, and they went back to Hartford, and Hartford blew them out in Game 3. Brad Shaw had a huge game. I think he had 4 points, and then they went up 5-2 in Game 4 after 2 periods. I think I triple checked this, so I know it's right. They were 27-1-1 when leading after 2 periods. They were up by 3 goals on home ice, and the Bruins won 6-5 in regulation. And instead of being up 3-1, it was 2-2 going back to Boston. The Bruins won Game 5. The Whalers won Game 6. Bourque came back for Game 7, and the Bruins won the series, advanced to the Cup final. I can never, as a hockey watcher, and if I were a Whalers fan, it would make me mental. It would make me insane.
Yeah.
But as a hockey watcher, even in those days, in 1990, 80s was rip-roaring, fast, a lot of goals. But even in those days, to blow a 3-goal lead with that, and that team was really, really good. That team was...
Would a cup have prevented a move?
Yes. That's my belief. Because, for a lot of reasons. Because, this region's going to support a champion. You look at what happened with UConn, and specifically the women's team at UConn, when they had the undefeated season in 95. The region just went crazy for them. And it's funny because SNY did a documentary about the 95 undefeated UConn women's basketball team. And to hear people talk about, well, this was like Connecticut's pro team. And I was like, they had a pro team then. They still had the Whalers in 95. I mean, and again, that's part of the confluence of events because there was the lockout in 94-95. And the Whalers, that was the first year of Karmanos. And Karmanos was ready to invest big, put money into his team. He had spent years wanting an NHL team. He was ready to, deep pocketed, ready to throw his money into the team. And there was a lockout. And then what happened, the UConn women's team went 35-0. And by the time the season was saved in mid-January, it was right after that Tennessee game where they shocked Tennessee on Martin Luther King Day, and this whole region went nuts. And then the men's team was regional finalists that year in 95. Yeah. So, I always say the rise of UConn basketball had such an impact on this region, but also, to that point, if the Whalers had a real chance there in the late 80s and early 90s when UConn was not quite there, with Calhoun was just sort of taken off and it was just sort of building his program, and they had such a chance. Even if they had gone to the Cup final, I think, the Francis trade doesn't happen then, right, because then they're going to pay him as this great player, as this number 1 center. again, presuming that he if they get past the Bruins and then they go on a deep run and he puts up some points, because that was the other thing. He didn't put up a lot of points in playoff games. He told me that he had been injured in the Canadian series in '86, and I think he had like 1 point in 7 games in that series, and he, I think he had cracked ribs. He said, and he hates that he didn't get the chance to perform in that series. And Dineen had the memorable goal in Game 4. He had the goal in Game 6, the game winner where they won 1-0. But just he always felt, he didn't put up a lot of points in playoff games for some reason, and they went out in the first round for so long. I mean, you guys know hockey. Hockey's a team sport. A single player can't. Connor McDavid can take over a playoff series, but the few others like him can do that. And Ronnie Francis, never wasn't quite that player, and didn't. I mean, he was an exceptional player, but he wasn't the type to take over a game or a series, but more incremental. And he had a great year in that '90 season too. I think he had 101 points. Yep. And if they had gone deep in the playoffs and maybe not won the cup, but certainly even a deep playoff run, because they had that run to the Game 7 in '86. They threw a parade, so I don't think they would have thrown him a parade for making the second round again in '90, but there would have been so many more different elements. Like I said, the Francis trade. Then in '91 they played the Bruins and Francis was gone and Samuelson was gone and they blew up the roster and then all sorts of. But I always point to Howard Baldwin leaving gets pointed as a huge element in terms of the organizational shift. But that '90 playoff series really to me is like the underrated element that doesn't get brought up enough. Because then they would have had some bragging rights on the Bruins. Then maybe some Bruins fans who live in Connecticut say, hey, well, maybe I'd like to root for the Whalers. Maybe I'll root for the Whalers in the playoffs. This team's pretty fun. They have a theme song. They have this arena. This arena's bigger than Boston Garden. It's cooler. And then they it just was another instance of the Whalers being the little brother again.
I guess I still go back. The reason why I go back to the Liu trade is that even though he did have injuries that year, he had a career. It was his career year, and when you're going into the playoffs, you don't trade away your franchise goalie,
Sure.
even if you think he's not the future.
Yeah.
Even though, obviously he wasn't the future.
Yeah.
But you don't trade away your franchise goalie going into the playoffs for a
Yeah.
fourth line center.
Yeah, for sure.
And actually, even when I see Ivan Corvo at the reunions at the Argos, he even tells me, I should not have been traded for him.
Yeah.
He flat out says that to me.
Yeah, and I think some of it was Kay Whitmore. They had drafted him, I think, in the first round. And obviously, he didn't pan out either. And
Right.
and like I said,
Career backup.
goaltending was just such a fickle element because if they had gotten it in '90, they would have gone deep. Then they get Frank Pietrangelo. 2 years later, essentially stands on his head, forces a Game 7. If they had had that goaltending, and Pietrangelo wasn't some otherworldly goalie, he just was a guy they brought in
Right.
that year. But
Mainly because of injuries.
yeah, but they had if they had had a goaltending performance like that, where someone stood on his head for 7 games, with that team, they would have made some noise. And then if they had the team in '92 that they had to match the goaltending with Pietrangelo, because Pietrangelo was awesome in that game, especially in Game 7.
Oh, yeah.
And that Game 7 was just such the last playoff game, and actually the only playoff game the Whalers ever played in May, but only because it went into double OT. I think the game was started on April 30th and ended on May 1st, but also because of our strike that pushed the playoffs back by a week that year. But yeah, it was just it's and that's why, like I said, it was such this unique confluence of events that really led to their demise. Between certainly there definitely should be more introspection made by people who were in the region, who, if they're disappointed, because that's the other thing Howard Baldwin talks about, is that he says the region lost its self-esteem. He lost its ability to dream, was how he put it when he was going through that whole thing with AEG and the state and all that stuff. Because again, he asked for $100 million, and the people of Hartford, the Hartford area fan support wasn't there for it. To his point says that if he points to Winnipeg, in fact, because he saw that his goal was to come in and attract fan support and attract to the AHL team, because that's what Winnipeg supported an IHL team. It was before the AHL had come there, right after they left for Arizona, which history is not kind to them. But they supported the IHL, and then they built the downtown rink, and then they had the AHL, and then they sold they were getting 15,000 people a night for an AHL team, and it's Canada.
What of Northland owning the atrium
Well,
and basically stopping like any renovation that the state wants to do to the XL Center?
Well, that's still, I think, under negotiation right now, but
Well,
you're right that they are trying to.
One would hope. I mean, I forget the name of the developer, but they did Climate Pledge, they did UBS Arena, they bought Spectra,
okay,
and they want to do stuff with XL.
yeah.
And you also have Gino like basically twisting the arm of the state to do something with
Yeah,
XL.
yeah.
So
Well, they are, I think this off-season, I think they are putting in the sports betting on the, in the west,
Right.
on the west side of it, just that area.
I think my understanding is that some of it is cost prohibitive, and I think, obviously pandemic related as well, because you look at, construction has only gone up, the cost of construction has only gone up, and like I said, this is why it's so remarkable to me that Howard Baldwin was asking for $100 million 10 years ago and got laughed out of town. And now you look at what $100 million is going to do for that building 10 years later. It's not going to be, They were talking about a full scale renovation with luxury seating and club seating and the low, luxury elements in terms of a concourse underneath the seating, and like they have at MSG where they have, food options and drink options and luxury club seating in the around the lower bowl. And then refurbish the concourse and add bathrooms and add higher end dining. because it's not even necessarily to attract hockey; it's to keep the building relevant.
Right, yeah, because otherwise the building will be mothballed.
Right,
Yeah.
in terms of UConn hockey plays there, and the men's and women's basketball team obviously do too. But you mentioned UBS, and UBS is a competitor now, and Newark is now a 15-year-old building, but still nice and competitive. And the Garden was refurbished in the last 10 years, and Barclays is there. So that's 4 buildings in New York. You still have concert venues in Hartford area, outside concert venues. You have the one in Bridgeport that's becoming a concert venue. You have that arena right there. And and I think it's just to keep the building relevant and to attract events more so than, and also, to keep UConn people happy and keep attracting recruits and because Gino Auriemma is not going to be the women's basketball coach at UConn forever.
Yeah.
And so, and that program will at some point need a shot in the arm where, the facilities have very much lapsed. It's very much almost a 50-year-old building that has gotten some slight renovations, but it's not been the broad, expansive renovation that New York got, that New Jersey got. And it's not like people are in, Boston, there's the new arena. It's like almost 30 years old, but it's
that got a facelift too, though.
yeah. So it's not like there are only so many dates you can do on a concert tour where and people will go to Boston. People from here, people in Hartford area, they'll go to Boston. They'll go see events in Boston. They'll go to Hartford if it's not a good experience, if the cost of parking is extravagant, or if they're not getting a first class experience for their buck, then they just won't go. And I think, and like I said, some of it is just the rising price of construction and cost, and just it's such a disappointment because the buildings is such a great. It's so easy to get to. It's so easy to the city is very easy to navigate, and yet it's a 50-year-old building almost, and it's falling upon disrepair. And I think the people of UConn are smart enough to realize it now, but that, they probably should have realized it years ago, when they were throwing public money when there was the talk of public money going into the Civic Center, because UConn would have benefited from that too, in terms of, certainly the basketball programs and now the hockey program in Hockey East. And what's interesting to me is that you mentioned growing through college hockey is, how, UConn's going to continue to have a footprint in Hartford, which I think is so cool.
Yeah.
Even with this new on-campus rink they're building. I know Stores to Hartford is doable. It's not convenient, but it's really interesting that that they're still going to play games on campus in Hockey East, but also still play some in the Civic Center like they do with basketball.
I think because the arena that they're building on campus only will seat about 3,500 when UConn is outdrawing that, especially on weekends.
Sure. Well, right, but I mean, I think why put money into that? Why put money into building a rink on campus?
I think it was because it was more for the women's team.
Okay.
Actually.
Okay.
More for the women's than it was part of the
Yeah.
agreement of joining the league.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Bradis is not up to standards.
Sure. Well, sure, but I mean,
know.
you think about the XL Center as the XL Center very much is on the standard of maybe not quite as cozy as some of the Hockey East arenas, but you look at playing games at a professional rink, that's attractive to recruits and BC and BU and the teams they're playing. The players who are coming through. I mean, and obviously Hockey East is raising UConn's profile for sure, and it's raising the profile of the hockey in Connecticut for sure. I think, but it's interesting to me that I mean that's what I'm saying is like that they would put an on-campus rink in Stores and then continue. But and I think it's great because, like you said, as Hartford is grasping and glomming onto UConn hockey, you want to have that tie, that organic tie to Hartford hockey. That's not just the Wolfpack, where they're going to draw 3,000 a night or if that, and you go to games, you could go to 2,000, 3,000 at the Civic Center. It is cavernous,
Yeah.
and it feels like there's like 50 people there, 100 people
Right.
there. It's like the
Yeah.
friends and family atmosphere, and even in spite, so it's cool to see that, to still have that sort of raucous behavior. But I mean, I think I wonder about to the point you made, Nathan, about the market, because there is indications that Hartford and Springfield share an airport. Springfield is very much part of Hartford's market, and yet the Bruins wouldn't cede Springfield as far as marketing territory. It was Bruins, and I think I mentioned it earlier on that New Haven was a little slow, was felt a little jilted maybe because they were the Hartford Whalers and not the Connecticut Whalers or the New England. I mean, they couldn't be the New England Whalers because the Bruins had negotiated that out in the WHA deal, but that the prospect of New Haven, Hartford, Springfield as a market potential is there. There's people. It's wealthy. There's industry, there's sponsorships. The NHL will go home again sometimes, and yet just feels like people can't get together, like you said before about running Howard out of town.
Yep.
And I think there's definitely potential there, I would say. And I think that's always the question that I get asked is that, well, will there be a team again? And I just feel like, and again, I vacillate on it because my heart would love to see it again. I'm sure you guys' hearts would love to see it again. I'm sure there's, we could walk outside here and poll the people and they would say, well, yes, I'd love to see the Hartford Whalers on the ice again. But is there the appetite for 41 home games a year plus 3 or 4 preseason games plus, with sponsorships? I always think about, whenever I think about that question, I think about nights like tonight, for instance. It's a Monday night. Obviously it's May, so it's a little different, but if you think about a Monday night in March, any Monday night in March, and the Whalers are playing a home game against the Winnipeg,
Yeah.
are 15,000 people going to go to the Civic Center and watch it?
Probably not.
Probably not. Is it, are they on a Saturday night?
Yes.
Yes. If it's the Bruins, absolutely. If it's the Rangers, for 100%. But I always just, whenever I think about that, I just think about, and yet, you look at the people, there's people out. There's people doing things. There's people, restaurants. They're out to movies. They're out, obviously pre-pandemic especially, but they're doing things, in New Haven. They're doing things in Hartford. They're doing things in the suburbs. They're going out. But it's such a weird perspective, and I always think about it because, when the Rangers are home, 18,000 people is not a problem at all. When the Bruins are home, 19,000 people is not a problem at all. Every night of the year. Now Boston's a different animal from Hartford. New York is a different animal from Hartford. You know, Chicago is going to draw 20,000 people to the United Center every night. Canada, forget it. Their waiting lists are forever. Except Ottawa. Yeah,
Except
I was just going to say,
Ottawa,
except Ottawa. You know, Winnipeg to the point where it's a remarkable they survived the pandemic because their financial straits get dire once one ticket is unsold, let alone a season's worth. But and that's always what I think about. Is just like, think about some random Tuesday night in January or a Monday night in March, or you know, a non-weekend night in the wintertime. And if it's 32 degrees outside, if there's snow on the ground, if there's ice on the ground, if it's raining, will people go to the game, or will they make the excuse, well, I'll watch it on TV, or well, I'll watch the Bruins on TV, or I'll watch the Celtics on TV, or I'll watch the Quinnipiac on TV, or we'll go see Quinnipiac, or we'll go see, you know, or we'll just watch something else on streaming or whatever. There's so many options, and again, I think that's what makes the market so interesting, is that there's wealth, there's industry, the insurance companies are coming back to Hartford, all the ones that left in the 90s and 2000s, and they're coming back, and urban development has never been more popular in terms of people, development in Hartford, in terms of housing, in terms of restaurants and some of those things that would attract people to live. There's the rail line that runs now from New Haven to Hartford into Springfield into the airport and whatnot. And yet, and as much as I say it's there, all the elements are there, is why it must drive people crazy when they can't bring it. And that's why I wrote about the chapter in Connecticut and how it looks on paper like, if it wasn't between Boston and New York, it would be perfect. It'd be tailor-made. It would be, St. Louis is St. Louis, and Denver is Denver, and, Raleigh exists, and all these other, cities that are smaller market-wise when you think of, TV market, Springfield, Hartford, New Haven. And yet, old habits die hard, old rooting habits die hard. And Karmanos made this point too, that they were always competing financially with the Giants and the Patriots and the Red Sox and the Celtics and these legendary brands where you're competing with them for sponsorships, you're competing with them for viewers on TV, you're competing with them for, it's not just the Bruins. The Bruins were the natural rival. It's not just the Rangers. The Rangers had Fairfield County, but and New Haven County, of course, to some degree. But there was just so much in terms of, and again, as the business of sports needed to become more lucrative, the Whalers just couldn't keep up. And how Chuck Hayton said, he and I agreed with when we spoke about this, and he said it again a couple months ago at this thing we did, that this is as much an economic story as it is a sports story, and that the Hartford was really the one true small market ever in the history of professional sports. When you look at, Canadian markets are different with hockey and maybe Vancouver with basketball, but there won't be a professional sports market like Hartford again, at least not as the Hartford Whalers. And I think that's what also led me to this story was to hear people talk about seeing, turning on the TV, turning on ESPN or turning on ESPN2 and watching hockey in the 90s and seeing Hartford on the marquee down below or on the scroll on the bottom. Or if they played a national TV game, they were on national TV. It put Hartford on the map. It made Hartford special from Providence, from Albany, from all these other cities in New England, all these other cities in the country. Hartford might as well be any city in the country in terms of, size, in terms of, landmarks, in terms of industry. And that's not to denigrate Hartford. It's just it is a city of it all its own, but if to outsiders, they might not know what makes Hartford special, and yet for 22 years they hosted a professional hockey team, and for 18 of those it was a National Hockey League team, and it's really what pulled me to it, was just to learn the story, and then I saw this incredible narrative arc again with the first 5 years and the trades and the crazy, terrible front office moves, and then legitimate cup contending teams playing in Hartford, Connecticut, and then to find out, I always wanted to know, why did the team leave? Because it wasn't as simple as just they couldn't get an arena. I mean, that's why they left, because they couldn't get an arena. They'd still be here if they could get an arena. But there was so much more, like, boil it down, it's that, but there's so much more to it. And to learn all about it and to put it all together and just put it in the book, I'm ecstatic about how it came together, and I'm grateful for the reception. I'm so excited that people are reading it, enjoying it, and Nathan, you've said so many great words and kind words. I so appreciate it, and I'm, like I said, tell your friends.
Yeah, I've been telling them. Hey, the thing I mentioned though first, I mean, because what do you think about? I know that this is what I'm going to say is deviating
sure.
away from the Whalers.
Yeah.
But what do you think of it as a parallel to geopolitical events? Because, I mean, granted, obviously, nothing was caused. What the Whalers didn't cause anything at geopolitical. But just this absolute saying of, oh, I'm just going to blame this person. It's their fault, and I'm not going to do what it takes here to change the situation. And I just think things are going to get better. And then you end up with January 6th.
I think you're 100. I think your point is taken, that there is a general lack of introspection around the country. I don't want to get too political, but I tend to agree with you in terms of, point the finger. People don't think, you point one finger, the three are standard coming back at
Right,
you.
exactly.
But the thing, I'll tie this to Hartford. So much of the city has moved on in terms of, and I mean, I was just saying before that I have such respect for the Booster Club and for people who consider themselves Whalers fans still to this day, because they have such passion and such excitement for their home city, for their home team, for this whole idea of the Whalers, and that these are the people that are making this live on. It wasn't just, the Hurricanes were late to the party in terms of putting the jersey on and putting the colors on and putting it on the ice, but they wouldn't have done that if there wasn't real grassroots support still for this organization, and that's what I think is, again, fascinating. There's the problem with blaming a lack of introspection is, again, a lot of people are done thinking about it. And I tend to agree with you, and even they had stopped thinking about it even as the team was leaving. You look at some of the people who were there that final day, that final game, that Sunday afternoon game against Tampa Bay. They went for the game, they went for the event, and then they left and moved on with their lives. The Whalers were done and gone forever. And I feel for those. I feel for the people who really cared. The people who shed tears, and I talked to a few of them, and I wish I talked to more of them. But the people who legitimately were crushed and heartbroken and devastated by this team leaving, because I remember how I felt when I thought the Devils were gonna leave, and I thought it was gonna be, and they won the cup, and they had this 11th hour arena deal, and it had saved them. And then I keep saying this, and it's really my belief that part of why, the Whalers could have had that too, but then they didn't get that 11th hour deal. They didn't get the championship that forced the hand of the league, or forced the hand of the state, or forced the hand of the owner. And what happened? What happened to those people? Where, again, I've talked to people like you, Nathan, who say that they continue to support the Hurricanes. They wanted to support the team because there were still ties. There was Maurice, and there was Deneen, and there was Francis. And Deneen scored the last goal in Whalers history, scored the first goal in Hurricanes history. And that 0-2 Cup run was fueled by former Whalers, Jeff O'Neill and
Sammy Kapanen.
Yeah, Sammy Kapanen and others.
Glenn Wesley.
Yeah, and Wesley was the last man standing when they won the Cup.
Yeah.
And John Forslund was still there, and Chuck Hayton was still there, and they all, and Francis had come back, and again, it was coached by Paul Maurice, and yet so many other people moved on with their lives. And then the people who were angry and bitter, and I agree that there is some introspection, and that's why I really wanted to, my goal was to tell a story, but it was also to challenge myth, because again, I started with a blank canvas. I didn't know any of this. I wanted to, my goal was to take all this information and put together what I discovered. And again, it's for people who lived the story, but for people who didn't know about it. And that's why I'm so excited to hear, your excitement behind it. That's why I kept telling you to read the book, because, I did not have any biases to this story at all. And that's why I think that's why I'm very excited and proud of it, because there were people who were fans who would say to me, hey, look, this is what happened. Chuck Hayton says, hey, this is, again, this is economics, or this is, the governor kicked them out, or then you talk to other people and they'll say, no, they were trying to get the Patriots. That's what happened. And then you get other people say, well, hey, look, Shanahan forcing a trade, that was the last straw. Or the Francis trade was the last straw. Or Howard Baldwin leaving was the last straw. Or he took all the cable TV money and that was it. And it's all of that.
Yeah.
And it's not one thing. It can't be one thing. And I agree that there is an oversimplification of rhetoric, and people speak in rhetoric, and people speak in talking points, and it's frustrating because everybody talks over each other.
Yeah.
And they don't talk to each other. They don't engage in meaningful debate, and then they go back to their corners, and it's over. And they still their beliefs, and their beliefs are unchallenged.
Because it's just like, as I said, it seems like here you had Jeff Jacobs, who I described.
Sure.
Jeff Jacobs is the Fox News of sports reporting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like within the
and
whole.
I like Jeff, honestly. Like I'm so grateful to him, because he gave me 6 hours to tell me every stories and history and all sorts of stuff. But he was just one piece.
But I mean, the reason why I don't is because he lied.
Sure.
And I sent him many letters to the editor.
Yeah.
Of course, the Current never published
Sure.
any of them, and he continued lying.
Yeah.
He never responded to me.
But I think that's why I felt I had a responsibility to do this more than just spew people's talking points.
Yeah.
It was to learn what had happened and present what I had found. And if someone came up to me and said, hey, look, I hate your book. I hate it. It's not true. It's completely false. I would be crushed, but that would be their opinion. But I think my goal was just to take the information and put it in a book and make it moderately entertaining, and hopefully people could stick with it. And I'm just, like I said, I just tried to do that to the best of my ability, and I'm just ecstatic about how it came out.